His liver sticks out of his coat. The truck driver's gut was an enormous protruding mass under his t-shirt. He appeared, to those with imaginations unsullied by television's hypnotic embrace, to have some kind of creature like a sloth or giant caterpillar wrapped about his middle. A smaller, secondary protrusion from the gut inspired a couple of self-styled wits to remark that the truck driver was so fat that even his gut had a gut. "That's his liver," a mannered, sensitive person would usually put in, speaking softly and trying to avoid hurting anyone's feelings. "Liver, eh?" was the response, and indeed it was hard to believe. Policemen had been known to stop the truck driver for questioning in regard to the protrusion. "Looks like you've got a small television or microwave oven under your coat," they would say. "Mind if I take a look?" "That's my liver, officer," the truck driver would protest. "Sure." The policeman would nod, reaching in and giving the lumpy cube of flesh a good pinch. The truck driver's howl of pain was usually all the convincing they needed, though some found it necessary to follow the truck driver to the hospital, scanning his abdomen along the way with special equipment developed for locating robots lost in the swamps outside of town. "Is he an alcoholic, Doctor?" Officer Mannerly asked. "That's the oddest thing about this case," the doctor, suave and trim in his lab coat, replied. "Aside for a couple of beers on the weekend, the man, a truck driver in his late 50s, claims not to drink all that much." "Alcoholics are prone to tell lies," the policeman reminded the doctor. "That's one of the things we learned in our training." "Yes, but this man shows no signs of cirrhosis, which one would expect to find in a liver engorged and distended in this way." The policeman took a step or two towards the nurse's station and back. "Are you sure it's not some kind of small appliance cleverly concealed?" "I'm positive." "Then what's causing it?" "Well," the doctor began somberly, "recent research indicates it could be the truck driver lifestyle. The fumes, you know." He suddenly laughed. Harvest. Autumn found the Lamage twins engaged in the hardest work a man can do outside of facing up to yet another day at the post office, the harvesting of a crop of auto beans. "What are auto beans?" Miss Watkins asked the grocer when she could get his attention for a moment. "Auto beans," explained the sweaty, aproned old man, "are the fruit of the Chemovac pylon, which is not a plant in any sense of the word as we know it, but a cunning facsimile thereof." He wiped his forehead with a rag and turned back to the crowd of children clamoring for a sample of the new Bologna. Miss Watkins' next logical question, "What is the Chemovac pylon?" was addressed not to the grocer, but to her father, Dean Watkins, the famed defense attorney, although it was answered by Lord Flumph, an anthropomorphic bear whom Mr. Watkins was trying to save from a murder charge. "Ah, the Chemovac pylon," Lord Flump enthused, clapping his large but clawless "Mark that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," paws together, and casting his mind back to the summers of his youth. "My uncle had a Chemovac pylon by the pond on his farm." "It produces auto beans, right?" Miss Watkins asked, eager not to look completely ignorant. "I don't know about that," Lord Flump confessed with raised eyebrows. As Lord Flump only spent his summers at his uncle's farm, it is improbable that he should be acquainted with the harvesting of the Chemovac pylon's fruit, as that event takes place in the fall. Dean Watkins reasoned closely, taking his pipe from his mouth and suddenly flipping through a large book of legal strategies. "But I do know," the talking bear continued, "that the Chemovac pylon is dangerous. With its 6 abrasive tentacles and its horrible rending orifice, it can kill and devour a cub in less time than it takes to scream." He leaned forward excitedly, but now sat back in his seat. "Fortunately, the Chemovac pylon is immobile, much like a tree, and that's why harvesting the auto beans is such hard work," little Christopher asked Luke, the elder of the Lamage twins. "No," laughed Luke, "it's because it's easier to let them fall off by themselves." Shadow. One of the reporters asked, "Some have claimed that your shadow, as it appears behind you on the dais, lends a sinister counterpoint to your avowed public stance as a man of universal brotherhood. What do you say to that?" "I say that anyone who would make such a claim," I replied, allowing my infernal gaze to sweep the room, "does not deserve to call himself my friend." A female reporter was next to ask a question. "You say that such a person does not deserve to call himself your friend," she began. "Does that mean that you only consider men your friends?" I stared at her for a moment, then smiled expansively. "I believe that's all the time I have for questions," I said. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen." I waved and turned away from the podium. Two things, I said to my assistant, Ross. Find out the exact definition of a rostrum. I want to know how it is differentiated from a dais. Second, who is that woman who asked me that stupid question? I believe her name is Kendra Flatchett, Ross replied as he held the door to the hallway open for me. She works for Gifunkus magazine. Gifunkus, I repeated. But that's... Never mind. Tell purchasing to buy it and have her fired. I entered a small antechamber to the left, where I loosened my tie and allowed Ross to help me off with my coat. Oh, and by the way, I added, as he then helped me to put on the long orange robe of soft felt, have somebody look at the lighting and see what can be done about that shadow. I thought you didn't care about it, Ross reminded me. I don't, I insisted, my hand on the door that led to the room beyond. I just want to see if it can be adjusted. Passing into the next room, I put on an open, understanding face as I broke into song. The delighted cries of the small audience of children greeted my appearance. At the conclusion of my song, I bowed to the children, both in the studio and watching at home, and took up the wand of indoctrination. Welcome, everyone, to the Cult of the Big Orange program. I'm your host, Toadskabode. The ecstatic cheer that followed was all I needed to take the bad feelings away. Indenture. The terms of my indenture were explicitly laid down on the tablet of correspondence, a stone record kept in the Hall of Notoriety. It was a source of embarrassment and anxiety to me that anyone bearing a celebrity card could be granted admittance to the hall and view the cursed carved document. One Monday morning, following a weekend in which I had attended a party where the fact of my indenture was unhappily revealed by an associate of mine, I hid in the mass of humanity across the street from the Hall of Notoriety to watch my worst fears realized. Tom Waits emerged from the taxi and ambled up the stairs of the hall. He flashed his celebrity card at the aged man on guard at the door and passed inside. The man who sang Going Out West would see for himself what had so intrigued him on first hearing of it 2 days before. I could picture the scene, Waits standing before the niche wherein the tablet lay, his hands in his pockets, his unshaven chin on his chest as he read the depressing words. Perhaps some lyric would immediately suggest itself to him, the basis for yet another song in a long series about wretched losers. As I stalked away from the hall, my steps turning inexorably towards the theater district, I could already see the marquee over one of the more experimentally inclined venues, Mail Room Servant, starring Skeet Ulrich in the title role and Dwayne Johnson as the wicked supervisor. I don't have to take this, I declaimed to a fellow pedestrian. You sure don't, he agreed. This wallowing in self-pity for appearance's sake, it's stupid, I said to another. Leave me alone. I'm getting out while the getting's good, I cried, this time to myself as I stepped down into a sunken nook. I flashed a bundle of keys at the trained paralytic at the door and passed within. It's scary out there, I announced to the room at large. It's about time you got here, a man in the commonly accepted attire of middle management replied, glancing at his watch. You can get started moving these boxes from this spot to that one over there. He pointed across the room to the half-scale replica of the Oval Office. The small man sitting there waved to me in a most friendly manner. Delay. As sorry as the representative of the train authority claimed to be for the delay, his emotional display was nothing compared to mine. I ripped one of his bench seats from its moorings in my rage, waiting, of course, until after the man had exited the compartment. Where will we sit? Asked the young man, who, along with his wife, were obliged to share the compartment with Bert and me. His tone, full of trepidation, barely concealing annoyance, struck a sympathetic chord within my mighty mechanical heart. I knew what it was like to appear weak before one's woman. I smiled as apologetically as had the train representative minutes before. Don't worry, I'll fix it. I'm good at fixing things. I wrestled the bench back into position and knelt before it. Bert, hand me the small bag inside my valise, will you? He did so, though obligated in no way to assist me at all. Reaching inside, I pulled out a tool of unique design, made for me by a craftsman of unparalleled skill who has unfortunately since died. I say unfortunately because I would surely have loved for him to have fabricated a pair of comfortable shoes for me. None that I have seen in the store suits me. Perhaps if I were to go back into the past... But that is fodder for some other tale. At any rate, in less time than it has taken me to ramble back to my point, I had the seat re-secured to the floor. There you are, I said, slapping the vinyl and getting to my feet with a minor grunt of pain. Good as new. The young man nodded, and he and his new bride sat down. I looked at Bert sitting there patiently reading a novel of suspense and decided that I had been raging needlessly. I could always do with extra reading time. What did it matter that the armies of stone were on my trail and it behooved me to exit the area as soon as possible? I'm going to go get a book too, I declared. Whatever, Bert replied, not taking his eyes away from the suspense. Out on the platform at the newsstand, I scanned the racks of paperbacks, finally selecting one, Pashko, Barbarian Archer. I had just handed the vendor my money when I heard the familiar sound of a train departing. Free of entanglements, Sam counted himself among the lucky ones. By his estimation, this select group comprised only about 1% of the population. Lucky indeed to be so favored. Of course, inclusion in the group was determined subjectively. Sam had no way of knowing for sure whether others included him among the lucky ones, though judging by their envious glances and outright hostility, he assumed they did. His luck, until now limited in its expression to his large disposable income and relative good looks, had really manifested itself only this week, with Sam's sudden liberation from all the niggling social obligations that had plagued him ever since his investiture with the purple sash. Now that that office had been abolished by federal fiat, he realized that he need never shake another hand again. No longer would he be required to bear with long suffering and a grace he did not feel the boring conversation of some ill-educated manual laborer. I can barricade myself in the tower and spend all day going through old documents, he said to himself in a flash of realization. If I want to, he added, looking at his reflection in the door of the microwave. He rubbed his chin. What did he want to do, now that he was free to do it? Of course, he could start dating again. He shook his head and laughed. The first thing he thought is to shave. But remember, to shave in luxury, without haste. He ran a sink full of hot water and whipped up a foamy batch of shaving suds. For years now, ever since abandoning canned shaving cream, he had threatened to start using a straight razor. Now maybe he could. Time was abundant. He applied the suds to his face with the brush and then cut down each limbless, leafless trunk of his beard with the razor. He was a Paul Bunyan among men. Afterwards, sitting in the autumn sunlight on the back porch of his house, Sam entertained the idea of tracking down his third-grade teacher. He longed to tell her, to show her, just how well he had turned out. Perhaps she had heard of his investiture and followed his career as Inspector General with pride. Maybe she considered that in some small part it had been her efforts and example that had contributed to Sam's ultimate success. How he longed to disabuse her of this notion. Pulling the horseshoe. The horseshoe, everyone agreed, needed pulling. As this chore had not been done in many seasons, however, no one was quite sure how to go about it. Let's ask old Gerke, suggested Bob. He'll know. This sounded like a good idea, so everyone except Rose and Michelle, who hadn't finished compelling the pylon and therefore had to stay, piled into Masterson's jalopy and drove over to old Gerke's house, somewhere out near the dunes. Jack and Bob went to the door of the little, weather-beaten cabin, the former rapping hard on it. There was no answer. "Old Gerke!" Bob commandingly summoned the occupant. Jack and Bob looked at each other. "Try the knob!" Sarah shouted from the jalopy. She was tired of sitting on Lewis's lap. Jack, who had deep moral reservations about what he called unlawful entry, declined to try this approach, leaving it to Bob. The latter individual, unburdened by such a straight-laced code of behavior, took the knob in his hand. "It's porcelain," he thought. "That's old." Aloud, he said, "It won't turn. It's locked." Sarah reached across Mac and Deborah and opened the jalopy door. She climbed over everyone and got out, precipitating the egress of all the others. Sarah joined Bob and Jack on the threadbare porch. She looked through one of the windows. "Can't see anyone," she said. "Put your shoulder to the door." Once again, Jack and Bob looked at each other. "I think that's going too far," Jack pronounced. "Oh, for God's sake, do it, Bob." Sarah mimed the requested action. Bob complied, and soon everyone was standing inside old Gerke's living room. "It's really more of a den, isn't it?" Mabel asked, looking about at the framed prints of typical nautical scenes. "Look at this!" Mac shouted from the bathroom. Everyone joined him, crowding together in the doorway, looking down at the skeletal remains tumbled before the toilet. Someone whispered something about flushing. Back at the office, Rose and Michelle, their personal assignment completed, took a look at the horseshoe and decided it didn't seem too hard to figure out. The old parliamentarian. Just before his death, the old parliamentarian, Wagstaff, summoned Broomwillow to his office and asked him to sit down on the chair before his desk. "Lord Bacon-Dip took a nap in that chair once," Wagstaff reflected, pointing. "Really?" Broomwillow replied, glancing down at the dog-eared patch of leather visible between his thighs. "Before my time, of course," Wagstaff continued. "I think he had just retired a month or two before I got my license." "You've been here a long time," Broomwillow commented, having little else to say. He decided to get things moving. "What did you need to see me about?" Wagstaff looked up at the younger man distractedly, having fallen into a brief reverie. The images in his head had been of the faces around General Slim Fist's breakfast table during that wonderful parliamentary retreat in the Ambicorcan moors 40 years ago. Funny how one could never picture one's own face as it had been. Perhaps film stars were blessed or cursed with such recall. "Eh?" the old man croaked. "Oh, yes." He opened a drawer on his right and reached within. Broomwillow was surprised, somewhat humorously, to see Wagstaff's hand reappear, filled with a heaping measure of gun. "What's that?" the younger man asked, thinking that Wagstaff, in making preparations for his forthcoming retirement, had decided to present him with a memento of their time together. Perhaps this gun had belonged to another of Wagstaff's celebrated colleagues from days past. "It's a gun," Wagstaff replied. "I'm going to shoot you, to kill you, in point of fact." And he held up his unoccupied hand. "Before you ask any foolish questions, let me tell you why I wanted you sitting in that chair when you die." "This is crazy!" Broomwillow barked and started to rise. "Remain seated," Wagstaff ordered. "It is vitally important that you be in that chair." "Well, I'm not going to be," Broomwillow declared. He was already on his feet, the high wooden back of the chair between him and Wagstaff when the gun went off. "Sir Manfred Mell died on that rug," Wagstaff informed the corpse. The unseen sniffer. Roland Emery, president of Global Standard Entitlements, sat at the head of the conference table. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have decided that the Unseen Sniffer will be our flagship program for the coming year." He had expected reaction to his statement to be strong, and he was not disappointed. "You'll forgive me for saying so, sir, but I think that's crazy." Chet Upton was the first to find his voice. "What makes you think I'll forgive you just like that? You're assuming an awful lot for someone right out of college." Emery folded a stick of expensive imported chewing gum into the space between his brilliantly white artificial teeth. "It's just an expression," Upton gasped. "Well, it's a crazy one, to use your other egregious comment." Emery turned to Rick Boldon on his right, a man whom he had relied on for the whole of his 10 years at the top of Global Standard Entitlements. "I will forgive him," he repeated. "Who is he to give me orders?" "Roland," Boldon made a spider of his hand on the conference table, "getting back to this business of the Unseen Sniffer, do you really think it's wise to place so much emphasis on what is, to be frank, a fringe program, a program of limited appeal?" "That," Emery pounced, shooting down Boldon's spider with a gun formed of his index finger and partially severed thumb, "is exactly the point. Of course it's a fringe program, a program of limited appeal, as you put it. I'm not saying that I expect the Unseen Sniffer to be our number one gleaner of advertising dollars, nor am I saying that I expect it to be our number one rated show. I'm saying that we're going to show the world the kind of company Global Standard Entitlements is. We're the kind of company that can afford to have a show like the Unseen Sniffer on the air. Hell, we're proud of having such a distinguished program on our roster." "But, sir," Chet Upton spoke up, "the flagship program? In the past, that designation has been reserved for the centerpiece of our Thursday night lineup." Roland Emery looked up and down the table, glanced back at the interns guarding the doors. "Did one of you fart?" he demanded. The confusing mime. "Just what is that mime supposed to be miming?" Mr. Grosvenor asked. He was standing in the window of his haberdashery, looking out on the street. Talbot joined him in the window. He watched the stereotypically attired mime for some seconds before speculating, "Is he pretending to be attaching an exhaust hose to a dryer?" "Ha ha," Mr. Grosvenor said sourly. "I'm serious," Talbot protested. "We recently bought a new dryer, and I had a devil of a time connecting the exhaust hose. What he's doing reminds me of that." "Bobby," Mr. Grosvenor called to another of his clerks, "come here and take a look at this. What do you think that mime is trying to express, if that's the right word?" Bobby Florence studied the mime's performance. "It looks like he's acting out the murder scene from Agripunto," he decided. "What?" Mr. Grosvenor demanded. "Oh, the hell with this. I'm going out there and ask him." "He won't tell you anything," Talbot said. "They're sworn to silence." "We'll see," Mr. Grosvenor growled over his shoulder. Talbot and Bobby stayed in the window, waiting for their employer to reappear on the sidewalk before them. Just as Mr. Grosvenor did so, a customer entered the store. Bobby was forced to deal with him while Talbot remained. The latter man was amused to watch as the performer answered Mr. Grosvenor's question with yet more pantomime. The mime appeared, as near as Talbot could make out, to be ingesting a series of small objects from a container, probably hard-boiled eggs from a basket. Now he was spinning about on one foot, He stopped and looked at Mr. Grosvenor with that mindlessly happy countenance that seems to be each mime's ultimate fallback. The expression of Mr. Grosvenor's face, however, was a study in aggravation. Talbot laughed silently. The old man had learned nothing. "He's just a damn idiot," Mr. Grosvenor insisted on re-entering the store. He saw Bobby dealing with the customer and nodded curtly. He found Talbot still in the window. "What did you find out?" Talbot asked. He assumed an expression of indifference, though his abdomen still hurt from laughing. "Nothing," Mr. Grosvenor snapped. "I think mimes should be banned from the sidewalk."